Simon Braun was born in Germany in 1827 in a small town called Friesenheim, which is in the state of Baden-Württemberg. Today, Friesenheim has a population of about 12 to 13,000 people, but would have been much smaller back in the early 1800s. In 1851, at the age of 24, Simon decided to leave Germany and go to America. Why? There could be many reasons. Revolutions of 1848, where citizens tried to take over government to have a democracy, but were defeated, created a hard life even for the common man. Then, back-to-back years of crop failures made things hard on farmers. Add in that population boom made the economy harder and land even more expensive. The population in Germany grew from 18 million to 32 million from 1750 to 1850. Then laws called for lands to be divided equally among descendants, which meant farms grew smaller and smaller to where they couldn't even support a family. Things were becoming very difficult in Germany. At the same time, the thought of an expanding country in America was very enticing. The population was moving west and land was cheap. Early German immigrants wrote pamphlets and spread them throughout Germany talking about the expanding land opportunities. All of these factors probably contributed to Simon deciding to make the trip in 1851. The trip itself had to be paid for. Some people were able to save enough money to pay for the trip, while others entered into an indentured servant contract where someone else paid for their trip. But they needed to work for that person for 2 to 5 years to pay off that debt. It's not known how Simon funded his trip. The voyage to America was almost certainly not a pleasant experience. Although steam engine ships were beginning to become popular in the mid-1850s and they shortened the trip, most immigrants at the time still opted for the more affordable sailing ships. A typical trip on one of these ships could last anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on the weather, currents, and the kind of ship you traveled on, but the average trip was about 8 weeks on the open ocean. On the ship, these trips were typically overcrowded with immigrants and steerage, which had small bunks, poor ventilation, and bad sanitation. It was common to have sickness spread throughout the passengers. It was also not common, but not unusual, for some ships to have a shipwreck and be lost at sea. After surviving the long trip, Simon arrived in America. When people typically envision their ancestors arriving in the U.S., they picture them sailing past the Statue of Liberty and getting processed at Ellis Island or even its predecessor, which was called Castle Garden. But those things came 40 years after Simon arrived. Instead, there were really no regulations or processing, and he was probably greeted at one of the many scattered docks throughout New York Harbor by people looking to steal or take advantage of new arrivals. Simon almost certainly didn't speak English and had to muddle his way through this mess. However, he did make it through, and he wound up living in Newark, New Jersey. In 1854, 3 years after Simon arrived, he married Anna Fisher in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Anna was also born in the state of Baden-Württemberg, Germany in 1829, 2 years after Simon, but it's unclear if they were from the same town or if they even knew each other prior to being in America. She arrived in America 1 year after Simon. Simon and Anna would most likely have experienced the very first ever World's Fair held in the U.S. and opened in New York by President Franklin Pierce. 4 years after getting married and while still living in New Jersey, they had their first child, Simon Jr., in 1856. In 1857, they decided to leave New Jersey for Minnesota, along with a flood of other immigrants. The population of Minnesota grew from 5,000 people in 1849 when it was made a territory up to 172,000 in 1860. Simon, Anna, and Simon Jr. were part of this migration. Minnesota and Wisconsin actually recruited people to their respective states because they were both trying to build their populations and towns. Pamphlets were distributed in several languages, luring people to come. According to Simon's obituary, he and Anna left New Jersey in 1857 with a colony of Turners on their way to New Ulm. This phrase Turners might give a little glimpse into who Simon and Anna were. Turners was the short Americanized name for the German Turnverein, a name given to German-American gymnastic clubs. They were considered to be an athletic and political group in Europe, and their motto was and still is a sound mind in a sound body, which emphasizes being mentally and physically active. They developed much of what is still used today in physical education in the United States. The Turner movement was generally liberal in nature, and many Turners had taken part in the revolutions in 1848, fighting for unity of Germany, but losing in those efforts. The organization was most closely associated with the uprisings in Baden, the center of the radical sentiment in southwest Germany, and the area where Simon and Anna had grown up. These facts may give some clue as to why Simon left Germany. In the U.S., the Turners were strongly opposed to slavery and were given credit for helping to get Abraham Lincoln elected. The Turners built halls throughout the U.S., which served purposes of gymnastics, meetings, and socializing. There is still a Turner Hall in New Ulm today that still teaches gymnastics and acts as a meeting hall in that town. While Simon and Anna and new son Simon were on their way to New Ulm, they were shipwrecked on Lake Pepin by the ice floes and were stranded on the Wisconsin side near Stockholm. They established a home here, and by 1860 they had two more children, Bertha, also recorded in censuses as Letta or Betty, and Anne or Anna. Simon began his old occupation as a wagon maker as the U.S. headed toward Civil War, and the Pony Express begins, and Abraham Lincoln begins his campaign for president. By 1870, the couple had lived through the Civil War and had added 5 more children to the family, 8 kids total, aging from 1 to 14. Emma, Ida, Richard, Robert, and Kate, all except Simon Jr. being born in Wisconsin. In 1870, the Braun family moved to the Minnesota side of the river to Greenfield Township. A land ownership map shows the 160-acre plot that Simon and Anna had purchased and lived on in the Greenfield area. Minnesota had become a state 12 years earlier, and the region went from predominantly Native American to predominantly white. Progress is occurring as 6 passenger trains now traveled each way daily on the main line between Wabasha and Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul. Big news of the times included Ulysses S. Grant acting as president, Susan B. Anthony illegally casting a vote, Jesse James was committing train robberies in nearby Iowa, and General Custer died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. The 1900 federal census shows that Simon and Anna, now 72 and 71, still lived in Greenfield with their daughter Bertha and 2 servants, a 57-year-old white male named Robert Carson, who was born in Mississippi, who was a printer, and a 15-year-old white male named Charles Preston, who was born in Minnesota and was a farm laborer. This census also shows that both Simon and Anna spoke, read, and wrote English, which they had obviously picked up over their years in America. By 1910, Simon, 82, Anna, 81, and Bertha, 52, still lived in Greenfield, but now lived with 2 of their grandchildren, 13-year-old Genevieve and 11-year-old Richard Craver, the children of their youngest child, Kate, who had been 41 at the time, but moved to Washington with her husband. Simon died October 19, 1912, at the age of 85, and left behind a great family. He is buried in Riverview Cemetery in Wabasha. His obituary read, "Mr. Braun was a genial old gentleman, pleasant to everybody, and a very kind and accommodating neighbor. In later years, he busied himself with a little garden in which he raised watermelons and other produce. He will be missed in this city, where he was a familiar figure, especially in the fall when he marketed his garden truck." Anna lived another year and a half after Simon's death until April 19, 1914, at her home in Sand Prairie, Minnesota, and was described as an earlier settler in this section. She is buried next to Simon and daughter Bertha at Riverview Cemetery. For years after their death, the children, grandchildren, and relatives of Simon and Anna would get together for a Braun family reunion in the Wabasha area.